My name is Sarah Danziger. Welcome, everyone. I'm the Education Program Manager at CPW. We are thrilled to have you all here for this week's Meet the Artist event, which we host every Thursday and is made possible by a generous grant from the Arnold and August Newman Foundation. Tonight, we are here celebrating the publication of the award-winning collection of essays, Race Stories, written by the cultural historian, curator, and writer Maurice Berger. Joining us in conversation tonight are noted curator, author, and CPW Advisory Board member Marvin Heiferman, artist and author of the recent publication Decolonization and Diversity in Contemporary Photography, the Dodge and Burn Interviews, as well as CPW's 2025 Saltzman Prize winner, Qiana Mestrich. And last but not least, MacArthur Fellow and collaborator on CPW's education initiative, Sanctuary City, artist Wendy Ewald. Maurice Berger spent much of his career studying and teaching racial literacy through innovative visual literacy projects. In influential essays, books, and provocative museum exhibitions, Berger gathered and presented compelling photographic images to engage and challenge readers and viewers into reconsidering both cultural and personal assumptions. In the final weeks of 2019, when humans were collectively just starting to glean hints of what would become one of the most life-altering events of our lifetime, the COVID pandemic, Maurice and Marvin were opening an exhibition of work they curated for CPW in our former home in Woodstock, an exhibition that would sadly be Maurice's last, as he died from COVID-19 related illness in the earliest months of the pandemic. I'll let Marvin speak more about that great exhibition. And so without further ado, I'd like to invite the first of our esteemed panelists to the mic. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for everybody at CPW for inviting us to be here tonight and talk about Maurice's book, which came out in December. It was published at the very end of last year. It's kind of out in the world. And when I've been doing events around the book rather than me just getting up and talking about Maurice's work and the book itself, I've just thought it's been more interesting to bring together people who are kind of in the same ballpark in terms of how photography functions in the world, and especially when it comes to talking about race and representation. So I'm thrilled to be here tonight with Qiana and Wendy. I wanted to start out talking about this exhibition. We were, Maurice and I never curated shows together. This was the only time we worked together on a project. And it was the juried show for CPW that year. And there were, I don't know, 400 or 500 people who had applied to it. So we spent weeks going through all of the sheets of slides and slides and slides, and it was an interesting experience to put the show together with Maurice. It opened in November. It included the artists who you're seeing here, and the press release for the show, kind of the explanation for it, said this: in the context of a society that is quick to define and stereotype women, people of color, and members of the LGBTQ community, the artists of photography now, 2019, celebrate their power as photographers to challenge cliches and find meaning through a variety of strategies. The Searchers, which was the name we came up with for the show rather than just call it a juried show. The Searchers recalls the work of the African-American intellectual and activist W.E.B. Du Bois. A century ago, he envisioned the search for identity, as well as the medium of photography, as potent means for reinvention, reappraisal, and personal discovery in the face of mainstream culture that's all too often denigrating people or rendering them invisible. Now, new generations of artists embrace photography's potential to liberate by portraying themselves, their families, their friends, and communities in dynamic images that counter the media culture that we ferociously consume, but neither own nor control. So doing the show was an interesting thing. I think it was also the last show in that space. It may have been before the Woodstock show closed. And featured in the show were works by Nona Faustine, who I had known, who's a graduate student of mine at ICP Bard, was one of the people in the show. This is a photograph of Nona and her daughter, Queen. And I'm showing it today because Nona died last month. So I thought I just wanted to recognize her. This is the book. This is Maurice's book. I'll explain a little bit about the origin of it. Maurice, as described earlier, had been writing for years about race and representation. He was trained as an art historian, and over the years, more and more thought that the kind of confluence of art and politics and social issues and social justice was where he wanted to be spending his time. So in 1990, he wrote an essay for Art in America called "Are Art Museums Racist?" that kind of rang a bell, pointing the finger at cultural institutions for the lack of diversity in terms of programming and thinking, basically. And that it was an essay that was very controversial at the time and has kind of become a kind of classic text in the field. Maurice at that point was working at Hunter College. I think writing this article and having it published was one of the things that got him out of teaching at Hunter College when they wouldn't renew his contract. He wrote for the Village Voice for a couple of years about everything from art to dance to the Supreme Court, and then started an affiliation with the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where he worked for almost 30 years and did all kinds of shows, among them being an Adrian Piper retrospective, one of the first ones of Adrian's work in 18 years before MoMA thought to do an Adrian Piper show. He did a show called White that was at ICP. It started at ICP that was looking at representations of whiteness that caused an interesting stir as well. Maurice was asked to do a project for the Smithsonian's African American National Museum of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and this was before the building was in Washington was built. So Maurice was doing a show called For All the World to See. It was about visual culture and the struggle for civil rights. And the show traveled around to multiple places. It was co-sponsored by the Smithsonian. This is Maurice in the Smithsonian space, kind of looking at some of the objects on display. The show was at ICP. It traveled to 6 museums, and then on National Endowment for the Humanities money, traveled for 10 years to another 42 venues around the country and was seen by more than 400,000 people. And the exhibition was, it was a kind of a startling one because it brought together photography, television clips, media representations of the civil rights movement, all to kind of build a bigger picture about what it took and how embedded visual imagery was in the struggle for civil rights. The show was at ICP in 2010. Traveled around for a while, and then 2012 came along, and it was Gordon Parks' 100th anniversary, and institutions all over the place were doing Gordon Parks projects. ICP wasn't, and then all of a sudden the idea came up with, let's do something in the window. And so they called up Maurice and said, hey, you want to do it? And so Maurice did this installation in the window at what was ICP's Midtown space at that point. It's on 6th Avenue and 43rd Street facing north, had monitors in it, some text in it, and Maurice was fascinated by it. That's him taking a photograph of the actual window because he realized how many people were looking at this, and he was very, very interested in taking the discussions and dialogues around race and representation in photography to bigger communities. What happened when this was in the window was Jim Estrin, who worked at the New York Times, walked by and saw it and called up Maurice and said, hey, you want to come over and have lunch? I want to talk to you about something. The New York Times had a blog. It was called Lens Blog that was very active. Jim was one of the editors. David Gonzalez was the other editor of it. And Jim said, maybe you'd like to write a piece about race for us. And Maurice did, and it got a lot of readers. And so they said, hey, do you want to do another one? And it became a monthly gig where every month, depending on what kind of exhibitions were around, what kind of books were being published, Maurice would write an essay. The essays were 1,200 words long. They're short. It was interesting for him to be writing in this journalistic kind of space for a large audience. And he used it as an opportunity from 2012 to 2019, when Len's blog was shut down by the New York Times, as an opportunity to talk about all kinds of photographs and all kinds of use of photographs when it came to race. So this is, most of the essays from 2012 to 2019 are in the book. And it's an interesting thing to see them brought all together. But he was looking at photography in a historical sense. So this was an essay about Emmett Till, the photographs of Emmett Till after he was killed, and about how his mother understood that those photographs of him needed to circulate. And in fact, that's where the title for the show came from. She was basically saying, the whole world needs to see these pictures. So the essays, as I said, were short, heavily illustrated. He wrote about civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and talked about their media savvy, their media awareness, and how they understood how important their appearance would be in the world through the spread of photographic images. He talked about stereotypes. He was very interested in how people had been stereotyped in photography and what kind of images worked against stereotypes. So this is a Pete Souza photograph taken in the White House that has become pretty famous because it's a kid whose father was in the administration and had left, and he's invited to go to the White House, and he meets Obama, and he's looking at Obama, and he says to him, "Is your hair like mine?" And Obama bends over and says, "Touch it, dude." And the kid bends over and touches Obama's hair, and it just kind of becomes a wonderful picture that Maurice wound up writing about again for the Aperture Vision and Justice project that happened in 2018. So the book includes everything from daguerreotypes to advertising, artist projects to reportage. It's kind of incredible. Rather than me talk about it, I always think these days, let Maurice talk about it. So we will. So this is a video that was made when Maurice won the Infinity Award at ICP in 2018 for critical writing.
Hands up, don't shoot! Hands up, don't shoot! Hands up, don't shoot! We fed up! We fed up! Can't take it no more! We fed up! Can't take it no more! We fed up!
Hail our people! Hail victory!
I think we're in a particularly dire moment. We're going through a crisis that's predicated, for the most part, on race. This is not an issue that's going away. I'm Maurice Berger, and I'm a cultural historian. I write the monthly Race Story series for the Lens blog of the New York Times. I'm very interested in writing about the things that would normally not be written about. It's like issues of race that people are uncomfortable with. My childhood was really informative about the way I see and understand race in America. I didn't grow up like most of my white friends. I grew up in a predominantly Black and Puerto Rican low-income housing project on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The racism that I witnessed left me realizing that nothing really quite compared to that in terms of the experience of prejudice. I was lucky in the sense that my white skin protected me from that. I loved my friends, and I saw how much pain it caused. That inspires and informs my view of photography, because I realized at a very young age that race was also a very visual thing. The color of your skin can make a whole lot of difference.
You will not replace us!
I think my essay on Charlottesville may have been one of the more provocative ones in terms of asking my readers to take a little walk with me into self-awareness. The virulent bigot may not be the redneck with the Confederate flag flying on their barn. The virulent bigot may be the guy who's dating your daughter. Or the virulent bigot may be the person who works next to you. The ordinariness of racism hasn't changed really at all for a really long time. The most telling parallel to the photographs in Charlottesville in the context of the United States were photographs of lynchings. You look at the people milling around, they're also ordinary folks. They're also the farmer and the dentist and the storekeeper. They're just these white folks, right? And yet they've just murdered someone without remorse. Because the essay was about the ordinariness of racism and the everydayness of it, I was actually asking my readers not just to say, look at those bad white supremacists with the tiki torches, as ridiculous as those pictures were, but to also start to think about their own stuff. Some of the greatest damage done in the name of racism is not really done by white supremacists. It's in the everyday interactions of people. Even in the most liberal places like San Francisco and New York City and Boston, the slights, the microaggressions, the subtle dismissals, the fearful behavior. You see a little bit of that in The Americans. Robert Frank's image of a black couple startled on a hill in San Francisco. What is that telling you? Photographs are all about focusing. They're all about details stilled to one moment. And sometimes, if you capture the right moment, that story, that image, is more valuable than as many words as you could summon. It's why Frederick Douglass was the most photographed American of the 19th century. It's why the great leader and intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois curated an exhibition on the portrait. The camera could be used, not just to sway white people's opinion, that was maybe secondary, but to allow African Americans who were under the gaze of a mainstream culture that either ignored them, denigrated them, or subjected them to all manner of stereotypes to represent themselves as they wanted to be seen. I think one of the great photographers of the 20th century, without doubt, for me, is Gordon Parks. And the one thing that Gordon understood was that photography was a medium of inspiration. Gordon believed that if white Americans held stereotypical views of black Americans, what would it mean to take photographs of black people that instead of the differences that fuel their racism and fuel their stereotypes, there were mostly similarities. A couple reading the newspaper while their daughter was doing her homework on the floor of their living room, at the barber shop, or taking your child to the movies. And what Gordon felt very strongly was that images like that could inspire something that was not all that common in American life in the middle of the 20th century, and that was empathy. That it could undermine the very concept of difference that drives the motor of racism and segregation and bigotry by disarming the idea of difference itself. I shouldn't, photographs are like children. When you write about them, you shouldn't pick your favorites. But for me, one of the most extraordinary photographs, a photograph that every time I look at it, my adrenaline rushes, I get a tear in my eye. I just can't believe how beautiful and brilliant this photograph is of an aunt standing with her young niece in front of the colored entrance of a movie theater. The woman is Joanne Wilson. I interviewed Joanne Wilson 50 years later after the photograph was taken in Alabama. They're in their Sunday best, of course. You have to be in your Sunday best in a world that demeans you. You want to show that world you're not who they say you are. The little girl wanted popcorn. She could smell the popcorn. But no way was Mrs. Wilson going to walk that child through the back door of that theater. And I asked Mrs. Wilson, is there anything about the photograph you don't like? She said, well, the strap of my slip was showing. And to me, that strap is the strap of a woman preoccupied with a little child. She's not thinking she's in Vogue magazine at that moment. She's thinking of that child. And that's what every mother does. Every aunt does. Every grandmother does when they're with a child. The great Gordon Parks, with that camera in his hand, allowing this school teacher and her niece to somehow walk into history. That photograph is the ultimate. Nothing gives me great joy than writing about young photographers like Latoya Ruby Frazier and Nona Faustine. To hear Nona talk about Gordon Parks, I too use the camera as a weapon of choice. To see this beautiful transference of the power of the camera from generation to generation is to me one of the most beautiful and energizing things to watch. When Nona photographs her mother or her child, she's also sending a message about anyone else's mother or anyone else's child, which is that we're worth photographing, we're worth being represented, that representing us can be a powerful act. Nona is saying that it's possible to photograph your world and make something extraordinary of it, make something meaningful of it, make something very moving. It's the work of a photographer who is deeply committed to looking at the issue of the personal as a window onto the historical. I think, for example, of Latoya Ruby Frazier's photographs. The photographs she took of her own family in Braddock, Pennsylvania, tell both a personal story and a story as big as the world itself about the reality of neglect, the reality of gentrification, the reality of dying towns, the reality of what it means when we lose that more cosmic notion of family.
Most Americans don't talk about the other. You know, it's going to be through Maurice's essays where history is going to show that there was a collective of African-American photographers and artists that really care about the history of this country, the history of our culture, and how we are moving forward and being shaped. And I think he sets the example and the tone that if more Americans were able to comfortably talk about the elephant in the room, we would be a more equal and just society and civilization.
The problem of racism is not over. In some ways, it's much worse because people think it's over. I see my New York Times pieces as exercises in pedagogy. How do you teach the reader racial literacy through visual literacy? And maybe in reading what I have to say, inspiring a person to think, how can I change? How can I change my attitudes? What am I doing that's hurting someone else? And also to let my readers of color know that they are being heard, that their images matter in a mainstream culture where their images still don't matter as much as they should, that there's brilliance and beauty and profundity. It's all out there. And if the visual culture that you're living with doesn't reflect it enough, at least in this tiny little way, we'll reflect it at Lens.
Great. I just want to end with something that Nona wrote about Maurice. This is the essay that he refers to in the film. But when we did the book, I asked a couple of people to write about Maurice, and this is what Nona wrote. I was a first-year graduate student in 2012 when, after an evening event where students presented their work, Maurice came over to say how much he liked and admired what I was doing. I still remember the personality and the energy he had about him as we talked about what I felt I needed to do in my work, and he urged me not to be deterred or swayed by those around me. Maurice, knowing about race and how things go in grad school, sensed I was drowning in the program, and I was. Overwhelmed, singled out, and bullied. That night, I felt like Maurice became instantly my fan club president. I almost tuned him out, thinking, who is this guy? But something in me said, no, calm down for a second and listen to him. And from that moment on, he was a mentor to me. During my second year in grad school, Maurice was the person who gave me the project name for the photographic series that eventually grew out of my thesis project. I had originally called it Reconstruction, and he said, no, that sounds too academic. Call it White Shoes. And I thought that was perfect. Thinking about your work in a progression of images made by African-American picture makers like Gordon Parks, Rudy Carava, and Marilyn Nance was not something I was doing in advance. All those photographers who came before me, they're incredible. I never thought I'd be in that canon. You do your best work, you pay your dues. Everybody's got their stories, you know. But really, someone else needs to come along and help you. What Maurice did was like saying, I know what you're doing and I know why you're doing it. Maurice was one of the people who came along and helped me. So, yeah. With that, I'm going to introduce Qiana Mestrich, who was part of that class, actually, same year as Nona in ICP board. And part of why I wanted to invite her to be in this program was what she's gone on to do in the last 10 years, which is remarkable in terms of her own work, in terms of a blog that she started. And she's got a new book that's just come out by Routledge Press that features something like 30 interviews or something like that, something based on it. So Qiana, we'll take it from here, and then Wendy, and then I thought we'll talk, because I think there's a lot of issues that people share in their work. It's this idea of talking to people, talking with kids, giving people a voice, and kind of creating dialogue. So with that, Qiana.
Oh, I'm going to try to get through this without crying. Thank you, Marvin. It's an honor to be here and to share the stage with both you guys. And that's, yeah, Wendy. Thank you. I was super nervous this week about talking at this event because, you know, I really knew Maurice through Marvin after going to the ICP BARD MFA program, and Marvin was one of my professors there, and that's really where I encountered his writings and his work. And of course, Maurice went on to write about two of my classmates, Kim Weston and Nona Faustine, both of whom I had also interviewed on my blog, Dodge and Burn, that I began in 2007. And I began this blog during a time when I was working a full-time job, not in photography, but having been formerly trained in photography, both in high school and college, I was really looking for a way to reconnect with photography. And I was also following a lot of blogs that sort of emerged out of the 2000s, Joel Kohlberg's blogs, Colin Penthall, Pete Brook, all of these bloggers that were blogging and about photography. And I was really looking for a source where I could find photography that featured artists that looked like me, honestly. So I, you know, with my limited digital publishing skills, decided to start this blog called Dodge and Burn. The Dodge and Burn blog sought to actively establish a more inclusive history of photography, highlighting contributions to the medium by people within underrepresented cultures. It highlighted those who are often dodged from the art scene and burned in art history. So although it has a very technical name, it was not a technical photography blog at all. photographers of African, Asian, Latino, Native American, Pacific Islander, and Aleutian heritage, women photographers, and the works of photography about these and other indigenous communities of the world. There were various digital iterations of the blog, as you can see here. So I wrote the blog for about actively from 2007 to 2018, and the majority of the blog posts were photographer interviews. I really was interested in the firsthand account of these photographers, how they got into photography, what their formal education or their self-taught education was in photography. And then I also, after graduating the MFA program, started this critique group in 2014 because specifically I was listening to a lot of students of color coming out of programs and saying, you know what, within these institutions, the critiques are very much limited to technical and material aspects of the imagery. No one ever really wants to get into the content, into the actual themes and the issues that I'm grappling with as a person of color. And so I formed this group as a safe space, a safe community in which we can talk about and get constructive criticism on their work. And it was aligned with the original mission of the Dodge and Burn blog, and it was committed to supporting photographers of color by providing a space for them to discuss social and personal issues around race, gender, and identity as if expressed in the work. And attendance wasn't exclusively for photographers of color. It was just, you were invited, whether you could come along and communicate and act respectfully. So when I was actually working at ICP in 2014 or so, I was approached by Routledge to do a peer review of another photography book. They had recognized that I had this blog, and they asked if I could do a peer review. And then upon submitting my review of the book, the editor then said, hey, we are wondering if you would like to do a book based on your blog. And I said, of course, wonderful, great. At that time, though, I was pregnant with my second child, and not knowing how my world was going to explode with the responsibilities of being a mom to two children, it took me quite a while to complete the book. And so it just released last month, March 2025. And the Dodge and Burn book is a print manifestation of the photography blog, actively published from 2007 to 2018, including a selection of 35 interviews with photographers and art professionals from these underrepresented communities. In addition to the interviews, there's a foreword by Carla Williams and 7 critical essays on photography by myself, ranging on themes such as the post-colonial gaze, Black motherhood, self-representation, self-preservation art practices, America's history of redlining, Black female performance, and more. And so I'd like to talk about a few artists that are featured in the book. First, starting with the cover artist, Nakia Brown. Nakia deals with issues of beauty, Black female beauty, specifically uses hair in her work quite a bit. And as you can see in this image, she's sort of playing with synthetic hair. And also in the next slide, she poses her subjects. I'm sorry, I'm kind of thrown off because my notes aren't here, but I'm going to try to, talk as well as I can to the memory of my notes. She poses her subjects in these really stark images, and here they're eating this artificial hair, which is, back then in 2012, certainly was a prominent theme within, social culture. A lot of people, a lot of Black women in particular, were turning towards wearing their hair more natural. And so this sort of act of eating hair was kind of radical in a sense, but also very much an issue, a contemporary issue, because just this year, there were consumer reports that came out about how the synthetic chemicals in this type of hair are cancer causing towards women. So Nakia's work for me kind of lives eternally within this idea of Black beauty and culture. Albert Chong is a Jamaican artist, Jamaican-born artist of African and Chinese ancestry. And in these slides, I've included some of the quotes from their interviews as well. His work particularly investigates family and his multicultural family dynamic. He says here, my work has investigated the role of family and ancestry in the constructed identity that is the artist. One of my better known bodies of work are the still life photographs that I construct, sometimes using old family photographs. In the context of the arrangement, they create shrine-like tableau that renders these ancestors into icons. Albert is also a practitioner of Rastafarianism, and this image is part of a series called Eye Traits, which deals with this concept of self-perception and self-determination in Rastafarianism. For me, as a Buddhist, I was raised Buddhist, this image also reminds me of the Buddha, Amida Buddha, which is a major deity within Eastern Asian Buddhism. Hernez Davis, also an alum of the ICP BARD MFA program, works specifically within traditional black and white darkroom photography and makes these beautiful photograms that are life-size. And they specifically reference self-care in her work, and this idea of the womb, which she states here, with womb, I started making it out of a pure need to express something irrational and impossible. I wanted to start my life over again. I wanted a do-over. What would it be like if I could raise myself with the care I wanted and needed? So it's really about sort of using this dark room space, this dark space in which she makes these images, almost in this complete blackness, of course, as a way to sort of reinvent and reinterpret herself and to heal from historical family traumas and personal traumas. Here's another image from that series. Lola Flash is probably an artist that many of you know. She does a lot of portraits and is a prominent activist, I would say, as well as a photographer in the LGBTQ community. She's committed to making work around themes of queer identity and Black femininity, and also, to highlighting older women specifically in their prime. And this quote here, she says, I am a committed artist using photography to challenge stereotypes and offer new ways of seeing, who brings many years of experience as a teacher, photographer, woman, a variety of diverse skills derived from engaging in high and low art, working with children, adolescents, and adults from diverse cultural backgrounds, from traveling and enjoying life as such. So she's also an educator, and that I think she also brings to her work. This is from a series of hers called Salt, in which she creates these portraits of older women. This is actually Toni Parks, who is Gordon Parks' eldest daughter. Jenna Ireland is a photographer who early on in the Dudgeon and Burn critique group joined us before she moved out to California. She, in this particular series, The Spotless Mirror, she makes this work referencing a Black woman who is a wife living in sort of a wealthy, white, affluent household that is her husband's family's household. And they're beautiful images that aren't necessarily self-portraits, but they do sort of reference a bit her own personal life stories. In this quote, she says, I don't think of the portraits in The Spotless Mirror as self-portraits. Yes, I am in them, but they don't have a lot to do with who I am. Maybe the woman in the photographs could be my sister or a self from an alternate universe. I didn't disguise myself because the work is so much about being visible, and looking like someone else would defeat the purpose. Jenna's really well known for her photographs of the architect Paul Williams, prominent African American architect Paul Williams. She published a book of the work of his buildings in 2020. But she continues to make personal work about family in particular. These are her two children. And I love just the tongue-in-cheek sort of play on color here, RGB. But I really also love Jenna's work because it counteracts this sort of negative, stereotypical view that we see of African Americans of just constantly in poverty, constantly struggling. She really presents an alternate view of a wealthy, well-to-do Black woman. And rest in power, my sister, Nona Faustine. I was one of the first, the Dodger Bird was one of the first people to interview, the first publications to interview Nona about the series White Shoes. But I'm particularly drawn to her work in the series Mitochondria about her family. But this particular quote here is about the White Shoes, where she says, quote, "What does a Black body look like today in the place where they sold human beings 250 years ago? No other medium but photography and film can do that." This particular image was shot in Coney Island, which Nona always lovingly referred to as Brooklyn's Riviera. And she loved going to the beach. And this is her here lying and basking in the sun with her daughter Queen. And of course, you know, she always made work around, you know, historical sites where people were enslaved, particularly when in New York City. And of course, these shores of the Atlantic here in New York City would have also been a site that we now just play in, right? Nona also made a series called My Country. She was she really knew a lot about as her Southern roots as an African American. And she was also really proud to be an American, despite, you know, the treatment of Black people in this country. And she also wasn't afraid to critique it. And so I really enjoyed this series for the way that Nona used photography to really counteract some of these narratives, American narratives. Bria Combley is an Indian artist who emigrated to the United States when she was 18. She brought with her a suitcase of her family's archival photographs, her family album essentially from India. And with that work, she has transformed it into these beautiful layered images, into the series Buttons for Eyes. About this series, she says, as an artist whose work is bound up in the personal and refutably placed in the context of migrant narrative, the question in play is, how does the personal or private intersect with the political or public? And she layers these images with different sort of cultural references within her family. For example, her father was a trained pastry chef. So here we see some flour overlaid over a studio portrait of her and her mother. And then the motifs on top of the flower are just from some traditional Indian drawings and design. Here's another really layered image that I love, incorporating a map, a world map that shows India. And the series title is really interesting as well. It's something that her mom would tell her, like, you know, do you have eyes or do you have buttons for eyes? And it was just sort of like a funny poke, you know, saying, you know, can you see or can you not see? But for Priya, it's really like a reference to how sometimes we have this blindness about going about in the world, especially tied to this identity as an immigrant. How do we navigate this world? Marcia Michael is a Black British photographer who very early on, as she was studying photography, felt like there was a huge lack of representation of the Black figure within Black British visual history, photography specifically. And so she began this series, The Study of Kin, using her own family. This is her daughter here, and using very Victorian photography techniques as well. and very formal sort of sitting and posturing. In this quote, she says, "For the projects, the study of kin, I had to learn different historical techniques to make images. I had to test the techniques to see which would have the best platform to explain my work. I used photogravure, photo etching, wet plate collodion, album imprinting, and Becquerel daguerreotype." This is a series of The Object of My Gaze. The title of this image references a law that was passed in the 1600s in Virginia and throughout the sort of British colonies in America, that said that any child born to a mother who was enslaved should also be enslaved. But this particular body of work, Marcia is exploring her matrilineal connection to her mother, and what the mother passes down, both from a genetic perspective and from a cultural and personal mothering perspective, and how they're both intertwined. So she wears her mother's clothing and then portrays her mother as well in her own clothing to sort of establish this connection. And those are the two bodies in the middle. Kaylin Roach is a photographer who also uses family archives and uses this sort of history of his father's photography work in his own work. This is actually a school portrait of Kaylin himself. And I really love how he treats the surfaces of his images as well. He really sort of does these interventions into the images that can sometimes be quite startling and unsettling, but I think they really speak to his personal experience as a young Black man in this country. He says here, quote, complexity lies beneath the surface. Nothing is simple and nothing can be wrapped up into a nice little package. My whole self is beneath the surface, and I invite the viewer to see beneath the surface through placing one in front of them. Here's an image of my mother, and I love the sort of radiation that comes out of this etching, this scratching into the surface of the emulsion. Gabriel Garcia Roman is a queer Mexican artist who lives in New York City. And he has been well known for the series Queer Icons. And he really takes the sort of religious Catholic iconography and applies it to a lot of his family and friends within his own community. He says here, quote, as an artist, I'm constantly looking for ways to counteract the flatness that's inherent in photography. Weaving, folding, cutting, and most recently collaging metallic or textured paper are all different attempts at realizing that goal. Here's another beautiful image of a young family. Most of you knows Keisha Scarville. Her work is in the gallery next to us, behind me. Keisha works with, also with archival imagery, as well as images that she, takes of her own. She says here, quote, my father's earliest passport photo was of particular interest to me. The image was taken when he was barely out of his teens, a time before we knew each other and existed as father and daughter. I would stare at it for long periods of time and look for clues about this young man frozen in the distant past. And she says about her family, while I still document my family, I've chosen to keep those images private. I've become less invested in documentation and have embraced a more conceptual approach, one rooted in latency, which she talks about a lot, and the right to opacity. I have focused a great deal on the somatic experience of loss and absence, which lead me to place myself in the images. This was a terrifying notion for me, but it is more fitting for exploring how the body registers these narratives. Andrew Jackson, another Black British photographer, living in Canada now, also making work about a Black British community. He says here, quote, a key factor in spurring my interest in photography happened when I was a child. I remember as a young boy waking up one morning and hearing my mother crying faintly in the distance. I'd never heard her cry before, and I followed the noise and watched from the top of the stairs as she cried down below. After a time, she walked away, and I could see that she left behind her an envelope on the bottom step. I walked down the steps and opened the envelope. Inside was a Polaroid photograph of a headstone in the graveyard. This is a portrait of his mother, who came over to England during after the Windrush, which is a generation that was brought over mostly from Jamaica to the United Kingdom for employment purposes and for building the country essentially after the war. Kim Weston was another artist that Maurice interviewed and wrote about for the New York Times Lens blog. And she is also a fellow MFA graduate. This particular series called Dancing with My Ancestors is really beautiful. For me, you know, she takes this sort of idea of the photographic blur, which a lot of people may think, you know, is a mistake, is an error, is a movement of error. But for her, it's really a movement of spirituality. It's really looking at the life that is happening in front of her. She is of African American and Native American ancestry and attends powwows quite often with her family, and considers everyone at the powwow her family. She says, quote, "I've learned how to surrender and not control the outcome of my photos. I'm not looking for the perfect shot. I'm looking at how a spirit or spirits want to reveal themselves in my images. I use my camera to capture what it feels like to dance in prayer or to be a vessel between the spirit realm and the physicalness of living on earth." So thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
I am going to show a couple of projects that come from the past, but also tied me to Maurice. And this project I had been working on because I was working in a school that was predominantly white, and another school that was predominantly African American. And it was over many, many years in Durham, North Carolina, and over many, many years, there were two school systems, and they tried and tried and tried to unite, but it would never get voted. Sorry, it would never get voted in. And finally, let me move this down. Oh, thanks. Finally, when I was there, and I had been working with many teachers in both school systems, and who I respected and were very fine teachers, and also were very artistic and open to looking at their students and what was happening at that particular time. And so I did this project to begin with two teachers, one Robert Hunter, who taught in the middle school, who was an art teacher. He is African American, and Kathy Fine, who was a white teacher in a elementary school with predominantly white children. And so I don't know how I came to this idea, but I was thinking that there needed to be a way for these conversations to happen, because they finally voted to merge the two school systems, and there had been no communication really being between them. And so Mr. Hunter and Kathy Fine and I decided to create a project that would allow them to have some communication. And anyway, so this is the way that Damien Barnett, who was one of the middle school students, African-American middle school students, decided he wanted to start his project. And the project went as follows. They first wrote about themselves as themselves, and that is Damien is on the left there. And then they wrote another self-portrait as if they were a member of the other group. And in at this point, it was all almost African American school. So so they were making things up, but when they started, they decided that they were fearful. But then when they started writing about who they were and who they would be if they were white, they got very excited and involved in it. And then they went home and brought clothes as if they were a white person and as if they were themselves. And then we set up the backdrop and, figured out where they wanted to be and how they wanted to pose. And then they were Polaroid pictures, so they could see and they could change things if they wanted. So that's, so obviously I started seeing so many things from these pictures, and they started communicating with each other. And when there was a mixed class, then they asked the other students to help them figure out what to wear, how to pose. And of course, we understood pretty quickly that Xavier is saying, if I was white, I will change my name to Jonathan on Family Matters. 2, people will call me a saltine. 3, I will be a rock star on stage. 4, I will stay in school. 5, going to funerals will be different. And 6, I would like going to Greek restaurants. So it became like a really easy thing for them to do and to think about. And anyway, especially when I did this over like about 4 years. And so as it went, there was more conversation. And of course, people were interested in it. So here's Heather Rose as her white self, and she's holding her stuffed animal, and the stuffed animal's reading. And one of the things that I found is, or we all noticed, that the only kids reading at that point were white kids. That changed, but at that point in time. And this is very prescient. My name is Jonathan Tarp. I live in Washington, D.C. I want to be the first Black president. I think I can be because I'm nice, fair, and have good judgment. And if I can't be president, I'll be a cartoonist. And my favorite food is pizza, etc. So, obviously, that was in 1997, I think. It was quite a while about, and then the idea that he was going to go to a nice school for college, and he wants to go to Harvard. Okay, so this is Antonio Gunter, and he imagines being a boy, a white boy, as being someone without a community. That if he lived in, as he's living in his own community, he's comfortable and alive, and then as a white boy, he's homeless, he stinks, he found the jacket. But it was more of it was very telling. All of these things are packed with ideas and thoughts. This is Gregory Blake, and he decided to use opaquing ink instead of scratching, because they had first of all, what they would do is I would shoot with them, we would shoot the pictures, then I would give them the negatives, because it was positive negative film, and then they would change the negative however they wanted, And they also at the same time were learning about scratching, the physical ideas of photography and a negative and a positive. So there were a lot of different pieces to it, which were very engaging for them. Yashika and her white self. And they're also, I mean, to me, they were just many of them were beautiful pictures. And this is Brandy Bishop, who's imagined she is an African-American princess, and she's on the playground, and there's a little boy in the back next to the tree with his back. So all of these pictures were taken out on the playground, basically at the school. And then finally, we get this as things start to change, that Courtney wants to be both white and black and doesn't want to have those same distinctions. But this, it took a couple of years before that changed. And then, of course, when the schools did come together, a lot of things happened that were both good and difficult, and but at first very, very difficult. And the kids were scared. The African-American kids did not want to go to school with the white kids, basically. And so it was at this time that I met Maurice and Marvin. And to me, it was so amazing to have somebody I could talk to about this. There were teachers, that I could, but as fact as any artists or other people working in this educational vein, it was difficult to find. So that sort of became the beginning of our relationship at a birthday party. And then I kept working in this way. And I did a book called American Alphabets to explore what America was racially, and not only racially, but also spiritually. And this is from my it's from Maurice's whiteness book, but it's also a white alphabet, a girl's white alphabet. And so, typically describing, this is the girl, and this is what I asked them to choose a word to, and then to make it either a sentence out using the word, or to talk about what the meaning of normal was in this picture. And so she's saying, typically describing something that is usual or conforms to the standard. Often people prefer to think of themselves and be thought of as normal. However, how does one know what is normal? Something is only normal when it has conformed to its surroundings and does not stand out. However, if moved to a different surrounding, the previously normal thing would become strange or different. Nothing is ever truly normal. And this is from the series, of the White Girls Alphabet. And so then that was another project that I worked on with Maurice, which is his whiteness exhibition at ICP, and then we also did a project together in Baltimore with the kids there on whiteness, and here we go. This is I did this in at the school that I went to. And, so again, they chose all these things, and first of all decided, what what word they wanted from the alphabet, and then I shot it with a 4x5, and then they took the negative and worked on it in any way that they wanted to. And again, it was very interesting. And sad. And that's what they noticed in the end. When they made their, as a group, they made their list of words that they were going to use. And then once they heard the words, they thought about it and how, and also we did research on what the school was like 100 years earlier. It was a progression of what was happening with women then and women at this point. And the women at this point, although they had a lot more agency, they also were not able to take any political roles in the school. Not that they just wouldn't. It was too risky. So tearful and understand and, and then you had the one African-American girl, not African-American, I mean Latino girl, being a rebel. And then victim was pretty chilling. So I feel like I'm connected to, I have always, well, not always, but I've been fortunate, very fortunate to be connected to Maurice and to Marvin. So thank you guys.
One of the things that struck me when I was thinking back to that ICP BARD MFA program and that class that Qiana was in and Nona was in, the thrust of the class was producing work and figuring out how to get work out into the world on your own, understanding that the kind of institutional systems of galleries and museums were hard to crack and that people were going to need to do things for themselves. And it's interesting to think about what the kind of projects Wendy was doing and the projects Qiana was doing, and this sense of dealing with subject matter and issues of the kind that we've been talking about today, and how necessary it is to make stuff happen for yourself. And, and so I wondered if the two of you want to talk just briefly about that, because it's not as if there's, years ago there was, I always think when I'm teaching in grad school years ago, there used to be this fantasy that you go to graduate school, you'd have your thesis show, people would come, galleries would pick you up, your career would get made, you were fine. It's not like that anymore, and which is fine, because I think the kind of projects that the two of you have done and supported and encouraged other people to do are things that wouldn't happen in conventional institutions necessarily. So can you just talk briefly? I mean, when you started that blog, that was right out of grad school, yeah?
No, it's actually way before grad school. I started it in 2007, and I didn't go to grad school till 2011. Wow. So I started it, as I said, when I was working full-time job. After I graduated college, I tried to get into the sort of photo world and quickly realized that I needed a driver's license, and having been raised as a city kid, I didn't drive. So, that sort of path to being a photographer's assistant, and, I had interned at McGargy, the MV Labs, McGargy event. What was Jim McGargy? And I forget the other person's name. They had a lab in the meatpacking district, now Tribeca. But even just having those connections, it was hard to find work in photography after I graduated college. And I had studied in college with Joel Sternfeld for 3 years, and really thought I was going to be a photographer. And but that didn't really happen right away. So I made this blog sort of as a way to reconnect after working full time in digital kind of web production and digital marketing which I still do full time to support myself and my family. But yeah, for me, publishing the blog, I was sort of thinking back to a time when I had a one-on-one conference in college, and I asked, are we ever going to study the work besides Gordon Parks? Love Gordon Parks, love him to death. But are we ever going to study anyone else? Are we ever going to study Latin American photographers, Asian photographers, women photographers of color? And I was told, go look at the work of Carrie Mae Weems and Lorna Simpson. And I guess, they assumed that, I was kind of trying to make work in that similar vein around Black female identity. And so luckily I went to Sarah Lawrence. There were books there from those two artists. And so to your point, that was really a self-discovery that I had to make on my own. It was never addressed in class. And for me, the blog was really a way to sort of address, people that I thought should be in the photography books that I had as textbooks, but who weren't necessarily.
And did it start to build its own community? It's kind of pre-social media.
Yeah, definitely pre-social media.
Yeah.
Definitely during the sort of this time where blogs were popular. Blogs not so much popular anymore. Sort of Twitter and all the short form social media really took over. But yeah, it did. It had, at its height, it had at least 1,000 unique visitors a month. And I would have people emailing me, educators emailing me saying that they would use the blog as tools in their lesson plans. And that was really great to sort of hear that, because that was really, I had started the blog as a way to educate myself, really, and to fill in those gaps in my own photography education. So it was great to hear that happen.
It's interesting because when people used to ask Maurice who his ideal reader was, he would always say really smart high school students. He thought that photography was a great way to connect with really diverse audiences and people with different experiences of different ages. And so it's interesting to see his pieces get used in schools a lot as well. But Wendy, can you talk a little bit about how you started working in education and how you kind of moved into that as it's part of this whole sense of how photography works in the world and in different communities and builds itself in communities?
Yeah, and also it was a time when it was late 60s, early 70s. And people were going into different communities. I was very lucky because I had really incredible teachers. And like Wendy McNeil was my teacher, who was an incredible photographer. But women didn't have really a very good place there. If you went to look at cameras in the camera store, they tried to sell you crap. And then when they would find out that Wendy was my teacher, they would say, no, you can't get this. No, we'll get in big trouble. So it wasn't comfortable. But it didn't matter, because all you needed is a few people, right? And Wendy was one of those people. And then I got to go to MIT. Not to, I wasn't enrolled or anything, but I was able to do some work on the side there, and then they would let me, help with exhibitions and things like that. Minor was making Aperture in the back room. So you could go there and, look and see what was going on. So, so I was just very terribly lucky. And then from there, I started going out, finding out how to go out and work in a community. First it was in Boston, but then I eventually went to Kentucky. But that wasn't until later. That wasn't until I got out of college. But it was always like looking for these things that these these ways to go and ways to think about. But as far as education goes, I had a brother who had was hit by a car and suffered brain damage. So I grew up helping him, and as it did my sister underneath me. So that was, and I figured out how to. The first time I saw him after he had been injured, I figured out how to work with him, to use visual things to get him reconnected to the words. I don't know how old I was when that old, but I thought this is kind of interesting. And eventually he did start to talk. So I sort of felt, a real sense of accomplishment, I guess, at that point. And then just sort of kept going, I guess. Thinking about visual images and the written word. And
one of the things that Maurice talked about in in that film was visual literacy and racial literacy. And it seems like both of you are very involved in working those angles in terms of actively getting kids to be looking at pictures and thinking about race. And Qiana, in terms of just the range of people that you've reached out to, is kind of extraordinary. And it's interesting. I mean, it's nice to be here talking about it because CPW is that kind of a space. One of the where these kind of conversations can happen, and that kind of freedom to explore things can happen, which doesn't happen much in museums, and certainly not in commercial gallery kind of spaces. And so that's part of why, the work I do is very much about photography playing an active role in culture and shaping culture and changing everything that it touches. And I think Maurice was interested in that too. As I said earlier, he started out as an art historian, writing about writing about minimalism, writing about artists like Donald Judd and Robert Morris. And soon he realized that was so rarefied and so disengaged from the world that he started figuring out that he would do something that was closer to him, and realized that photography was the medium to do it, right? Which is, kind of incredible, and always worked in public universities rather than private schools, because he grew up poor and because he wanted the dialogue to be a broad one. So, so I think that's kind of what ties some of these projects together. Does anybody have any questions for anybody here, or any thoughts, any responses?
I loved what you said, Wendy, about your brother and how that sort of relationship with him, getting him to express himself, and then you going on to do that in your photography with your students is a really interesting connection in your work.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It took me a long time to figure it all out. I don't know if you felt like that too, but at some point I moved from thing to thing to thing, and I began to understand that, but I didn't in the beginning at all.
Yeah, I mean, I since I was raised Buddhist, I always sort of believe in connection. I never believe in circumstance or luck or happenstance. I always believe that things are interconnected and interwoven. So it makes sense that one thing leads you to the next. Yeah.
I'm wondering about what are you doing now in terms of connecting? I mean,
what I'm constantly doing with my own work and connecting is connecting both my day job and my photography work. What I was talking to Charlotte Cotton once about this tension that I have about the fact that I do have this day job, but it's not in photography, that I wish I could only be focused on photography. And she said, that's your labor, and the photography is your work. And so I always love sharing that. But the work the collage work that I'm doing now is very much tied to my experience as a woman of color in corporate America, and expressing the struggles that this audience, this particular demographic has, both climbing the corporate ladder and just making inroads into
Yeah.
into the upper echelons of the executive levels. You know, the numbers are pretty paltry, and
Yeah,
it continues
sure.
to be. You know, even when we look at who's driving, you know, AI and the force of that, it's still very much very white and male. Yeah.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting, and like what you said about Maurice and what was using photography for that photography is such a medium that you can do that, and it makes it more interesting if you can use it to move something in the world in some way or another.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the idea of moving something along is interesting, and the idea of community around these issues is interesting. Maurice's book is the first book in a series that's being done through Aperture called Vision and Justice. And it's a group of people, Sarah Lewis, who edited Aperture's 2016, I forget what the issue was, 2016, 2018, called Vision and Justice, and it's built out into a much bigger program. And Aperture is going to be doing 6 books, and Maurice's is the first of them. But Sarah Lewis, after they did that first issue of Aperture, put together an event up at Harvard Radcliffe. It was called the Convening. It was called the Vision and Justice Convening. And Maurice and I went to it. It was also 2019, I think. And it was kind of amazing to be in an auditorium full of, I don't know, 1,000 people, 500 people, 1,000 people, all of them who were working around race and representation and visual culture. And to see the kind of collaborative spirit about it, that it was remarkable. And that was something Maurice used to talk about all the time, that people felt like they were all in this together in some way. And as you know, people can be competitive or careerist or whatever, but there was a bigger issue at stake. And I'd never been in a room full of that many people around visual images where everybody was kind of happy to be there, honored to be there, because they were working towards changing things.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's, I mean, to be able to use photography to do that is extraordinary.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing. Yeah.
Any questions from the audience?
It's really interesting to me that Maurice came out a public housing project, and I haven't read the race wars, but does he fold class as an issue into his discussions and photography as well? Could you say something about that? I'm interested.
Yeah, I mean, class was obviously very much on his mind. He grew up poor, and he saw where that put him in the world. And then as a white kid in, largely Black and Hispanic housing project, he saw himself in the world in a completely different way and got to, I mean, it's not so much to the class thing, although it probably is. I mean, he got to hear what people didn't normally get to hear, what white people didn't get to hear. And I think that just was something that really motivated him. I think, class obviously was a really big issue, and that goes back to the public university thing. I mean, he wanted to work out of UMBC because it was in Baltimore, and Baltimore is a Black city, and it's the most diverse campus going, and it's not a rich kid's school, and they do extraordinary stuff, and he felt really strongly about that. But he was conscious of it. He was interested. Like, one of the institutions that always took every exhibition he did was the Addison Gallery of American Art at Phillips Academy, right? So you kind of got a rich kid's school, right? And, Maurice was working out of there, and that was always a curious and interesting thing for him to be doing. He was aware of it, but I think that race is what interested him the most in terms of what he wrote about. But, looking at what Qiana was saying before about class and, that working against stereotypes in terms of class and race and how those two always go together. There was a book about Arthur Ashe that he was kind of fascinated with because they were portraits of him, and there was Arthur Ashe, the famous person, and then there's Arthur Ashe standing on the subway track, waiting for a train to come. So he was interested in all of those things, but race was where he thought he could do the most, I guess.
You could do a whole new book about class and photography,
Sure.
right? That is across racial lines, I think. So that's your next book, Marvin. Though I know you've got other projects.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I read something that Maurice had written, and my biggest takeaway was that I hadn't truly understood that one couldn't have full visual literacy without also having racial literacy. And I think that was like a really big takeaway from his work that I experienced. And I see, Wendy, you are engaged in that conversation as well, and making that argument. And I think you are too with the work that you're doing. Marvin, you are as well. And so I'm just wondering if you guys could touch on what it's like to be working to make that argument right now.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. I mean, even, I'm just thinking about what we're trying to do here with the kids in the high school. It's people are more fearful. Everybody is, I think. And I think we all try. It's like you have to redo a way of seeing and a way of thinking, I think now. I can't say too much about it, but it's not a good time.
It's a terrifying time. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm traveling next week and hearing all this stuff about, people being stopped in the airport, checking your phones. And I'm like, oh crap, I have a book that has the word diversity in the title. And it's all over the internet, know, and what is that going to mean for me traveling with my family? And my husband is British, and, even though he's an American citizen, will he be let back in? All these things starts coming to mind. And with all of this erasure of DEI initiatives and just scrubbing of websites and people of color off of official government sites, and it is really amazing because I thought that all of this history that Maurice wrote about was working towards us not being in this place that we are in. And it seems that that's not the case, that we're now taking a decade step back into a scary time. And it's a new scary time, but it's definitely an old scary time that we've already been in. Our ancestors and our previous generations have been in. So it's terrifying to have to be in this place. We just moved up from the city, my family and I, and my son goes to high school in Saugerties, and which is known, to be one of the more conservative towns up here. And, he is experiencing, racial slurs being thrown at him constantly. Both from white children who think that they're being cool by saying the N-word, and then both from white children who are using it as, with the hard R, as they say, in an aggressive manner. So, it's an interesting time. This is not something that we would have. My son had mostly white friends in Brooklyn as well, but it's not something that we experienced there much. Because you're around more people who look like you, but it's an interesting time, and
Yeah, I was thinking when I was just going over stuff, coming over here and looking at the history of the For All the World to See exhibition. That was funded by the NEH, right? That's big NEH money. That was at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. You kind of look at what's going on there. Maurice, that show traveled, as I said, to 42 museums and libraries all around the country. That won't happen. And you know, as you were talking, Qiana, I was thinking, well, maybe, you know, if there's not that kind of support for public projects, people can do things privately. But then, you know, I also post links to stories about visual culture every day, and I don't know, maybe it was today, maybe it was yesterday, but it was about how people's websites and social media sites are being scrubbed for images and references to anti-Semitism, you know, for example. So, you know, it's tricky. On the one hand, I'm sitting here thinking, well, maybe it's, you know, people just have to put things out there in different kind of ways. But I think people are thinking twice about
Doing it at all.
Yeah.
And that's the dangerous part, is the thinking twice.
Sure.
Right.
Yes.
I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
I remember, well, this is just a little story, but when you know, we went through the first after 9/11, and my show, that sort of a mid-career show that had lots of different communities and et cetera in it, and one of the communities was women in Arabic women in the Middle East that I had worked with, and they had the museum had put that image on the invitation, and you know, in the meantime, you know, that 9/11 happened, so everything had to be taken off, and you know, I mean, so I feel like, you know, we've actually been through this stuff quite a few times now, and I don't know where we can go together to do something about it. But anyway.
Yeah.
Question is for Wendy. It was wonderful to see you working with young people and children. And then that's great to see your grandchildren and your son here.
Yeah.
And your daughter-in-law, I understand, worked a lot with you.
Yes. Yes.
So children nowadays, you know, they're using and taking photographs, even sometimes before they can talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the high school students obviously are shooting a lot of photographs. And the camera can certainly, you know, even a cell phone camera can certainly be a great way to foster community, to cross cultures. But on the other hand, I would imagine that in a high school setting, it could also create division. How have you experienced the effect of, you know, the proliferation of digital photography among high school students? Has it created community or separation?
Well, it can do both. I mean, like right now, we're trying to work with kids from different cultures. I mean, but most of them are Latino, but and I think that, you know, amongst the groups it's okay, but every once in a while, the things like if there's a kid who has more money, then, you know, they come with their own, you know, fancy camera, and they have a different, they can be bullying, for example. But on the other hand, for some people who don't speak any English, it's a really great thing, or very little English. It's a great thing because they just work and work and work and shoot and write and, you know, Spanish. Yeah, but it's harder for them to do it. I mean, they're more insulated than as a group, but they're getting there.
Great. Well, thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all
Thank
for
you,
coming.
everyone, for coming.
There's, if anybody's interested in getting a copy of Maurice's book, there's copies over here at the desk. And yeah, thank you to CPW for having us here tonight. Thanks.